So we will talk about the decision-making process in today's lecture. It's not going to be a very long lecture, okay, first of all. And secondly, this topic about decision-making is something that can be researched and dealt with in greater depth in a lot of books, in the available literature that's out there with respect to decision making. This lecture is simply going to give you some sort of a bird's eye view on what it is and how people or managers go about with the decision making process in general. This is not meant to be some sort of an exhaustive approach to decision making as a process, but I do hope that after this lecture, you'll be given some sort of an appreciation on how managers and leaders do decision making. At the same time, I'm also hopeful that after this lecture, this will also give you some idea on how decisions are typically done for your own personal benefit as well. Now, we'll talk about the decision making process as a process. Okay, the content as to what is being decided, that's typically uh, varying, and definitely that's going to be out of scope. Okay, but we'll just simply focus on the process itself. So how does one, a leader, make decisions? I think that's the key question that we will try to answer today. As I said a while ago, there are many ways on how we can approach and attack this topic. Okay? So what I will share with you for today is just going to be a very good overview, okay? Which, in spite of it being an overview, would still give you enough material to actually appreciate how decision making is made. Now, a manager plans, organizes, recruits, staffs, leads, and controls his or her team by executing decisions. In fact, even at the granular level, everybody, and not just managers, we all do what I would call micro decisions, right? We'll be faced with a lot of micro dilemmas that would require a decision. Uh, Perhaps in a simple example, you can think of attending a class as a form of decision, right? You may have had that question, should I attend this particular session or not? And whatever the result of that question would be, that is your decision. Okay. Everybody goes through that, especially managers, especially leaders. However, what really defines and differentiates a good manager from a great manager would be the quality and the effectiveness of those decisions. And in fact, as managers move up the ranks, as they get promoted, as they have bigger responsibility, more often than not, what is really being inspected or what's being assessed of that person is his or her ability to make decisions. Okay? And the quality of the outcomes from that decision-making process. Now, this is your typical decision-making process. It looks linear, typically it is, but some researches, some deeper appreciation of decision-making as a science will tell you that it is not always a linear process. There are times that when you go to a certain step, certain things along the way would make you decide to actually go back. Maybe go back to the previous step or even to the very first step. Okay. So while it seems linear, we're always going to make the assumption that everything has perfect information. Oftentimes, the reason why certain people backtrack is because the information is incomplete. So in this case, we will make the assumption that the information given to the decision maker or to the manager is complete and perfect. Okay. And there are typically 7 steps that a manager would have to consider whenever a decision is about to be made. Okay. So there's defining the problem, okay, identifying limiting factors, developing and crafting potential options or alternatives, analyzing each alternative, and then selecting the best alternative, and then finally implementing the decision, and then along the way establishing a control and evaluation system to determine the quality of the decision making. Now, we'll start with the very first step, defining the problem. And I would say defining the problem is a very underrated step. Why is that? Because we're perhaps so used to the habit or the rhythm that we're always looking for answers. We're always looking for solutions. In fact, as we're growing up, we're used to a schooling system wherein moving up every year level or grade level is dependent on our ability to find the right answers. But later on, you will realize that it's not about finding the right answers that's important if you're a leader. It's all about making sure that you know how to ask the right questions, specifically the ability to define and formulate the problem. So in this step, defining the problem, this is a very, very first step, and for good reason. And yet people, especially seasoned managers, they have this, should we say, habit or instinct to just gloss over this step and trying to move right away and coming up with a solution. Sometimes that makes sense, especially if you're in a situation where there is a crisis, then there's that sense of urgency to arrive at a solution as quickly as possible. Nevertheless, whether it's urgent or not, the very first step, whether you like it or not, is being able to define the problem well. So what happens here? Well, we need to have an accurate description or definition of the problem. There's this famous saying, uh, it's attributed to many people already, but the idea there is that if you have 7 days to solve a problem, you'd probably spend the first 6 days trying to understand and articulate what the problem is. It may sound exaggerated, but more often than not, if you're able to properly define the problem, then coming up with a solution can be much, much easier. Now, if a problem is not defined well, it's not articulated properly, well, you can be assured that every subsequent step in your decision-making process would be flawed. Okay? And it sort of makes sense. Okay? If you have a wrong problem to start with, you're not going to come up with a correct solution. Okay. Now, what are the questions usually asked at this step? Well, what is the problem on hand? What is the objective to be achieved? So we look at the bigger picture. How will the decision impact people in the organization? So you look at stakeholders. Okay. What is the urgency and criticality of the decision? How fast do we need to arrive at the decision? And how critical or significant the decision would be across all other factors. Now, of course, there are many other questions that can be asked. Okay? These questions are just simply like your starter questions. Okay? But nevertheless, the whole idea here, in fact, is to keep on asking questions. Remember, you're trying to define the problem at the start. So what's really important is that you actually get a correct scoping of the problem at hand and not try to rush in arriving at a problem which is not going to be very comfortable for you. Maybe you've come up with an initial problem formulation, but it doesn't seem to be very solid. You seem to be able to poke some holes into it. Okay, if ever you've had that experience at the start, well, it's usually a sign that you need to firm up the formulation of your problem. Now, one way that a manager can help determine the true problem in a situation is actually identifying the problem separately from the symptoms. And this is a common pitfall for everyone, not just managers or even leaders, everyone. Sometimes they mistake the problem for the symptoms or the symptoms for the problem. Okay? It's like typically when you're sick, when you're starting to have some cough, okay, you might be thinking that it's just a regular cough. But coughing is just a symptom, and there's a likelihood that it actually points to a deeper problem, an illness that you haven't really arrived at the first moment you've noticed your cough. Okay, so the idea here, and the common pitfall that you need to be aware of at the start, in this step especially, is identifying the problem separately from its symptom. So not confusing the symptom as the problem. Okay, and what is a symptom? Okay, basically a symptom is an indication, a sign, a signal that something is wrong. Okay, in this case, there's something wrong in the organization, in a situation, in a scenario, but you can't really identify the root causes, not immediately. Eventually, when you start digging deep into the situation and trying to unlock what is underneath all of the symptoms, you will probably arrive at root causes. Okay? So definitely, acknowledging that there's a symptom, that's a good first step, but you have to go deeper than that. And that is something that should be done in this step when you're trying to define the problem. Okay? But again, the pitfall that everyone should be on the lookout for is not confusing the problem with the symptom, and not making the equation that whatever symptom you've noticed at first glance is already the problem. So here are some examples on how symptoms and the real root causes can be muddled. Okay. For example, if the symptom of the organization you've noticed, and this is directly observable, would be there are low profits or declining sales. It could be that an underlying problem would be there's poor market research, but it can also mean that there's excess spending, or it could mean that there is something that's happening outside in the market that is external to the organization. And all of them would exhibit the same symptom. Okay, you see? Symptom is different from the problem. You need to make additional triangulation and probing to really determine what the underlying problem would be. Okay, another symptom, high costs. Okay, now that's the symptom. You notice it if you take a look at your balance sheet or your financial statements. Okay, the cost item is quite high. So what might be the underlying problem? Well, it could be, in this case, a poor design process, poorly trained employees. Maybe your raw materials have gone up, become more expensive. Again, a lot of underlying problems, that's possible, but the same symptom. Okay. And you can go over this table and notice that for every symptom that's listed here, there could be more than one potential underlying problem. Okay. Now, will you ever arrive at that point that the underlying problem is going to be the correct problem that you want to define? I would say yes. Okay, but it takes a lot of hard work. You really have to probe. You really have to ask yourselves, okay, is this really the correct problem? Okay, are there other symptoms that point to the same underlying problem? So that's one way also to determine whether your problem is actually the correct problem, whether there are multiple symptoms that help support the possibility of that underlying problem. Okay, which is why taking the reference from medicine again, we typically give a list of symptoms rather than just saying one or two symptoms. So a doctor would probably ask us so many questions just to be able to triangulate, okay, those symptoms that you've mentioned with other things that you may not have actually considered as a symptom. So that's the first advice here as regards identifying the problem. Sometimes what we thought was a problem is not exactly the problem. Maybe it's just a symptom. Okay? So the lesson here is, okay, if you've noticed something, it's a symptom, dig deeper. Maybe there are other symptoms. Okay? And there are many possible underlying problems. It's even possible that you can have more than one problem that's occurring at the same time. That's quite possible. Okay. Again, borrowing from medical terms, you could have comorbidities, right? means there are multiple problems that's affecting you, which would point to the same symptom or same sets of symptoms. So, okay. Uh, but what's important is try not to gloss over this step and be dismissive and rush everything. Really spend the time to probe, question assumptions, and then match the symptoms with your hypothesis, okay, on what might be your underlying problem. Now, the next step in the in the decision-making process is identifying the limiting factors. So now you've identified the problem. Okay, what's next? So what are the factors that are limiting or would create some sort of dampening effect on the problem? Well, to do decision making, managers need to have ideal resources. Could be in the form of information, equipment, money, time, labor, okay, and identify any limiting factors. Okay? Realistically, managers operate in an environment that normally doesn't provide ideal resources. So now that you have a problem in mind, and let's assume for a moment that's the correct problem, right? Uh, you ask yourself, okay, I might have an hypothesis on how to answer this problem, right? And in my hypothesis, I might think that, okay, there are some limitations, there are some other factors that are not really relevant. Okay, so you try to weed them out. Okay, and there will be these limiting factors, okay, that would really constrain any efforts to actually have that problem solved. Okay, now this is where the concept known as satisfies or satisficing come into the picture. Okay, this actually is a combination or a portmanteau of two words. Okay, satisfying, satisfaction, and sacrifice. Okay. Obviously, if you were to be mathematical about your approach, you want to come up with the best possible, the most optimal option moving forward. But we know that's not always the case. That's not always possible. So by satisficing, we understand that the best decision possible may not be, in a more global or universal sense, the best solution or the best decision at all. There could have been some trade-offs that happened along the way. Okay, and that's the approach, and that's the behavior, so to speak, of managers. They tend to satisfy. They tend to know that, okay, I'm trying to push my solution to the best possible solution set, but I know for the fact that if assumptions were any different, there's something better than what I will eventually arrive at. Okay. So to satisfy is actually to make the best decision possible with the constraints that you have, with limited information, limited resources, and time available. Now, the next step is coming up with options, or what we call alternatives. Okay? So developing potential alternatives. And how do we come up with options? Obviously, you have a hypothesis, right? And in your hypothesis, there are many ways on how you can arrive at your conclusion based on your hypothesis. And one of the better known methods in developing options or alternatives is through brainstorming. You can do this on your own, or typically as it's done in a group, okay, where a group works to generate ideas and provide alternatives or options. Sometimes coming up with the wildest options, with the most creative alternatives, that's quite possible. Really stretching your imagination. Now, there are a lot of books and references that talk about brainstorming on what might be considered as good brainstorming. There are a lot of tips that can be shared, okay? But here are some notes, some guidelines. They're not really hard rules, okay? Like, you'd only want to spend 30 minutes to 1 hour. You don't want to spend too long of a time to do brainstorming. It's quite tiring, okay? And concentrating on the problem at hand. You don't try to mix it with other problems it's not really the focus of the discussion. You want to entertain all ideas. And actually, this is a very critical point. You don't want certain people monopolizing the discussion. So if you notice that somebody is not speaking up, you actually give that person an opportunity to speak up. Sometimes you even have to force that person to speak up so that you just have a balanced view of what can be provided as possible options. And the key element in brainstorming is that all ideas are good. Nothing has to be dismissed. Nothing has to be judged as wrong ideas. And that's a very basic principle in brainstorming. Nobody should say that your idea is wrong in a brainstorming session. All ideas are possible. Naturally, you have to constrain yourself from giving weird ideas. But even then, I mean, if you might think that the idea is weird, but if you've honestly tried to arrive at a possible option, and maybe at first glance you think it's weird, maybe it's not weird, right? You still need to raise it, you still need to contribute using that, and that's fine. Okay, that's the basic principle of brainstorming, right? You need to be open to ideas. You shouldn't try to dismiss or put down previous ideas. Okay? Now there are many other techniques that are used aside from brainstorming. So brainstorming is one method that you can use to come up with different approaches or different alternatives or options. Here are some, okay, like a nominal group technique. So this method involves the use of a highly structured meeting, okay, complete with an agenda and restricts discussions or interpersonal communication during the decision-making process. In short, it's a very structured meeting, typically facilitated by a very good facilitator, a seasoned facilitator, who would probably have some insight on the topic at hand even. Okay. Or another technique that can be used to generate alternatives would be the Delphi technique. Okay. With this technique, the participants never meet, so there's really no on-site discussion, nothing synchronous if you think about it. But a leader, a facilitator, uses written questionnaires to conduct decision making. So there would be some forms, surveys distributed to everyone. Okay, and this group leader or facilitator is like your hub, that where everybody goes to. Okay, so all clarifications will go to this leader. Okay, everybody else would probably not have met everybody else. Okay, there's some benefit to that technique. For example, it avoids bias or coercion in the discussion process. Okay? And there are many more. Okay, but these are just samples of techniques that you can use if you want to develop or generate possible options to solve your problem. Okay. Now, what are advantages of discussing it in a group? Well, there's broader perspective. There are things that you probably have not considered in the beginning. So sometimes it pays to exercise a little bit of humility when we're thinking of alternatives or options. Now, employees are most likely to be satisfied and to support the decision. So having group discussions, you're actually pulling them in the political process, right? This is different from an approach wherein, the leader, if the leader has to make a decision, the leader can do it on his own or her own, right? But if you provide an opportunity for the group to participate in the discussion, okay, the people involved in those discussions would be more comfortable accepting the decision of the leader, whatever that is, even if the decision runs contrary to the initial sentiment of the group members. Okay. And that's validated by research. And sometimes group members give support behind the decision for as long as the process was fair. Okay. So it's not about the decision itself that's important, but the process arriving at the decision that's more important. And another advantage is that opportunities for discussions help to answer questions and reduce uncertainty. So aside from the fact that it gives you a broader perspective, it tries to be exhaustive and comprehensive with your assessments of the risks. Okay. Now, the next step, after you've come up with your options and alternatives, how to analyze them. You try to determine the pros and cons of each alternative. And one way to do that, to determine the pros and cons, is actually performing a cost-benefit analysis. for each alternative. So each option that's listed in front of you, you try to provide a cost-benefit analysis. Okay, and you weight each factor. Okay, there are many ways on how you can do a cost-benefit analysis. One would be having criteria weights. Uh, you might ask, so how do we properly define the weights? Well, it's really up to you. Okay, you might have a benchmark coming from a previous situation, similar situation. You can use their weights in that case. You can rank each alternative. Okay, so after you've put weights in your criteria, you rank them. You do some sort of scoring. Okay, and then at the end of it, once you have some sort of a global rating for each alternative, then you come up with a decision. Okay. The advantage of this is that it helps you remove errors, particularly biases when it comes to assessing the options that's made in front of you. Okay. Sometimes we have this tendency to lean towards a particular option, perhaps because we like it, or we feel comfortable about it, or because we were the ones who proposed that option. But uh, unfortunately, it may not be the best option. So for us to minimize the impact of bias or error in these cases, well, we come up with an objective, hardcore criteria to determine the best alternative. There are many ways or many techniques that can be used to actually arrive at a very objective conclusion. Now, there are many factors in evaluating an alternative, okay, but these are three common factors that's used to evaluate an option. Or feasibility. The question is, can it be done? Naturally, if an option can't be done because it's impossible, then you tend to remove that in your list of options, or you give it a very low score. Okay, another factor would be effectiveness. How well does it solve the problem or situation? Does it solve the entire problem? Or does it solve part of it? Or does it solve the problem temporarily at this point, but that problem might crop up again in the future? So effectiveness is another factor. Consequences or outcomes of that decision. What would be its costs to the organization? What would be its benefits to the organization? What would be the things that we need to be on lookout for? Okay. So you look at the outcomes, the consequences. So these are also factors that you consider every time you weigh an alternative. Now, after going through your set of options, okay, coming up with a judging criteria for your options, the next thing that you have to do is to select. Okay, of all the alternatives given, you select the best alternative. Now, the best alternative, simply put, is the one that produces the most advantages and the fewest serious disadvantages. Now, before we leave the aspect or the discussion of alternatives, don't forget that status quo, okay, or the current status or the current situation is also an alternative. Sometimes not making a decision is a decision. It's quite paradoxical, but people don't appreciate the fact that sometimes the better decision is not to do anything, just to let the current situation move on, or what we call status quo. Okay? So make sure that when you're actually coming up with your list of alternatives, have the status quo as an alternative. And that will help you appreciate things better. Okay, sometimes, and this will happen, sometimes you will realize that the best alternative is just staying put, not doing anything, and just keeping moving things forward. Now, obviously, when you've selected the best option, you don't stop there. You have to implement it. Okay? And this is where the execution comes in. So prior to implementation or execution, that's all thinking. That's all brain, cerebral work. But what really makes a very, very good leader, very good manager is actually implementing or following through the decision. Okay? It's not enough that you say, okay, of the options listed here, option X is the best option. Okay, then do it. Okay, then do it. You know that's the best option, do it. Okay, don't stay stuck. And sometimes that's one of the pitfalls as well in decision making. We get so enamored or we get so attracted to the beauty of analyzing alternatives, going through the process, that we forget that the purpose why we're doing these things is to come up with an action. Okay. And that's where most people fail to appreciate things that, okay, more than the option or coming up with the best answer, it's really implementing and doing the action. Okay? And that's part of decision making. Okay? So implementation, execution is nothing more than putting the chosen alternative to action. And then at the last part, the last step is that you'd like to control your situation. Okay. And later on, you'll be faced with the idea that you'll be making more decisions in the future. And because you're implementing a decision, it's not just going to be like, okay, I'll implement the decision, that's it, that's done. No, it's possible that the decision would need a passage of time. Maybe it's a project, okay, a decision to approve the project or not. Well, you have to see the project through and through. Okay, so having that control and evaluation system is also important, and that's going to be part of your decision making process. And as they say, managers are paid. They're paid really highly to make decisions, but they're also paid to get results from these decisions. So it's very important that it's not enough that you say, I made a decision, okay, I kick off, I implement. Then, okay, I step back, I rest, I'll sleep. No. As a leader, as a manager, okay, this is where you need to, focus, okay, run the effort, okay. And for that, you'll need to have some sort of a system that will monitor the situation, that would help you do some tweaks along the way, okay. And then at the end of it, if the action to be done has been completed, then you decide, so was it a good decision or not? Okay. Ongoing actions will have to be monitored. Okay. And that's where an evaluation system should provide feedback on how well the decision is being implemented. Okay. What the results are, and what adjustments are necessary to get the results that were intended when the solution was chosen. So what are the usual questions that you ask at the end? So if you've noticed, you've asked questions at the start. So what are the questions that you typically ask at the end when you try to evaluate, did I make a good decision or not? Well, was the wrong alternative chosen? Okay, sometimes we came up with a conclusion, this is supposedly the best alternative. We executed it, and then we realized we didn't solve the problem. All right, well, no problem. All right, so what do we do? Okay, so, or was the correct alternative chosen but implemented improperly? Was it done very well? It was done sloppy. Sometimes that happens. And was the original problem identified incorrectly? Yeah, as we were saying earlier, okay, if you try to gloss the first step quickly, you'll miss it out. You may not come up with the correct articulation of the problem. And has the implemented alternative been given enough time to be successful? Like I said earlier, it's not just, okay, I decide that this is the option. Okay, we kick it off, you run it, and I sleep. No, that doesn't happen. You have to give it time. And with that, I end the presentation or the lecture on the decision making.